I'm Janet Macoska, and I have been photographing mostly rock and roll in Cleveland for 47 years. I've worked other places, but lifelong Cleveland person shooting a subject matter that Clevelanders love, rock and roll. And this is Peter Chakerian.
Hi there, 30-year veteran journalist here in Cleveland, born, raised, lifelong, writer, author, you name it, I've done it.
There you go. So the question many people have been asking is, what did you do on your COVID vacation? And this is what we did on our COVID vacation. Nobody really wanted to be stuck at home, and artists had nowhere to work. I couldn't shoot events or concerts because there weren't any. So there was an agent in London that had me participate in a David Bowie project, and she liked my photos really well. They ended up representing me, and she asked what artist had I shot a lot, and the answer was Bruce Springsteen. So I showed her some of those photos. She loved them, and Peter and I started on this endeavor that took up a good chunk of our COVID vacation. My part of it was to do a deep dive into all the negatives and slides of all the shows that I'd photographed with Bruce. And there were about 12 or 14 shows from 1974 through 2016, yeah. So that was my mission, and I found photos that I'd never even seen the first time around, because that's just the way it worked back then. Quick turnover every night of a new show and new negatives, and was able to really, through technology, scanning and finding these images and tweaking them, really found a good visual documentary of Bruce in Cleveland. And what's important, I think, at least in our book, we focused on the fact that Cleveland has this grand love affair with Bruce, and always has from the beginning. And Bruce similarly loves us as if we're Asbury Park West. So I think I want Peter to talk about the writing in this book, the narrative, and what you wanted to accomplish to complement the photos.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for collaborating again. We previously collaborated on a lot of different things over the years, but our first book together, All Access Cleveland, is sort of a retrospective of all Janet's work. We did that in 2015. The opportunity came up to do this book, and I was very excited. Bruce Springsteen obviously is a very important figure to Cleveland and to Cleveland's rock scene and to Clevelanders in general, just because of that blue-collar ethos, the hard-working ethic that people in this town have. When you look at a treasure trove of photos like Janet has of Bruce Springsteen, very quickly you recognize that this is not something that just happens every day. This is a concerted effort to sort of present him as he sort of grows up in front of Cleveland audiences, in front of Cleveland eyes. And people remember those shows vividly. And the best way to ensure that people would connect with these photos is to make sure that the narrative matched it, and did so in a way that sort of took people back in time, not just to the shows themselves, because a lot of people who buy this book or pick it up and take a look at it are going to connect to the tours themselves. Even if they weren't in Cleveland, they will see the context by which they saw a show in the Rust Belt or Milwaukee, you know, Detroit, some of the other places where he was also very favorite artist. And so my job in this whole thing then became, how do I put together the narrative that sort of talks about where he is in his life and his career, with family, what was going on politically at the time, not just here in Cleveland, but elsewhere, and sort of build around that. And part of that included building set lists for all of these shows. And people are very, very, what's the word I'm looking for?
Bruce fans are dedicated.
Dedicated is probably the best word for it. They know their information. They get into the minutia of all of it, and so you can't be wrong. You have to have all that information, dead nuts, dead to rights, and it has to be exactly as it was. And so I took that as a sort of personal quest to sort of make sure that everything was historically accurate, really sort of take on the role of historian and stitch that together in with the narrative that the photos, I mean, in a lot of ways they speak for themselves, but it was really wonderful to be able to add context. And that was what I loved about this project.
Some of the people who've been giving feedback about the book, and I worked on getting a flow to the photos. It's in chronological order, first of all, and getting a flow to the photos from each show, because I knew, again, with respect to our audience, Bruce fans know their stuff. They know this guy.
Yep.
So if they've been to a show, they know when a song appears on a set list, and they have a visual of what they saw. And I wanted to respect that and give them that feeling. Some people have even said, well, it's like watching a video, but it's, still photos, but it's like watching the concert, in other words. And they get the same kind of energy that they would have felt in that moment with Bruce, which is a great compliment. So because I know we have a limited amount of time, the first thing I want to start with is to let you know what my first concert was, going out to shoot as a baby at Cuyahoga Community College on the newspaper, having to fight to cover music. Finally got permission to cover a show February 1st, I think, of 1974 at the Allen Theatre. It was a British band called Wishbone Ash, which was a dueling guitar band. And opening that night was some guy named Bruce Springsteen, who was just a tiny bit known in Cleveland because WMMS had started playing his music. But this may have been his first trip away from Asbury Park in that area to come play a show, opening for Wishbone Ash. And at the Allen Theatre, it was sold out for the headliner. And here comes this scrawny little guy with the big man, with Clarence Clemens and a version of the E Street Band. And at that point, he's being dubbed a poet, another Bob Dylan, and really hasn't worked up the stage act or anything. And I have a camera with 12 frames of film. But the minute I see him and the energy that he's putting out, he and his band eat up 7 of my 12 images, so Wishbone Ash lost that night. But Bruce really succeeded, and after 45 minutes, he gets a standing ovation. So that starts the love affair between Cleveland and Bruce, and it's because the people in the audience were him. They were all blue-collar, working-class people who loved their rock and roll, and he spoke to them immediately. His stories, spoke to them immediately.
Yeah, and the great thing about this is with each chapter, you see him grow up kind of in front of your eyes, which is probably part of the reason why we hear a lot of time machine comments. We hear a lot of like watching a video or a concert, happening in real time. We get a lot of that because these photos are not static. They're very energetic. And of course, Bruce Springsteen is very energetic. Even now in his 70s, he still puts on 3-hour shows.
Right.
And so he grows throughout this book, and you kind of feel yourself growing with him. I came to Bruce Springsteen a little later than Janet did, but I definitely knew that something about him was unique and different to the kinds of bands that I was listening to at the time. I grew up with things that were a little bit more caricatured, we'll say Van Halen, Cheap Trick, Kiss, Rush, bands that kind of have this more over-the-top kind of almost, I don't want to say cartoony, but that's really the only word I can come up with, sort of a different kind of presence altogether. And then here comes Bruce Springsteen, and he just out of nowhere is just all over the place. And it's a throwback to all different kinds of styles. It's, You know, it's Stax Volt, it's Sun Records, it's Motown, it's all of this stuff kind of pulled together. I mean, there's even gospel thrown in there in some instances, and he just comes out with all of this and just gives you something that is all at once old, and it's the wedding analogy, something old, something new, something bold, and something blue, and that's just what he is. And the blue isn't just his jeans, you know?
You're getting a rock and roll education from Bruce Springsteen because he's pushing it through himself and his words and his stories. And that's the thing I think his audience really loves, is he's authentic. Doesn't matter what time period you hit him at, wherever you found him, you know you're going to get the truth from Bruce, and he's going to tell you stories from his heart and his soul about what's going on with him at that moment. So 76 is the next tour. It's Born to Run, and he looks just like, I don't know, he looks like something out of a Dickens novel or something.
Right.
But he's getting scruffier, but he's also wiry, and you know, he can go from one end of the stage, drop to his knees, and slide the entire length of the stage. He can't do that now. I'm pretty sure he can't do that now.
We can't either.
No, we can't either. But you know, he really gives 1,000% of himself when he's on stage, and there isn't, especially in Cleveland, there isn't an audience that wouldn't love him back to that degree. And you know, so I'll hit a couple shows. You know, I Shoot 'Em Again in '78. By 1980, he's really got his act together. I mean, he's a showman, and so there are certain parts of his act that he will repeat every night. Not necessarily the song list. He's well known for changing that up a lot.
Right.
But right now you have a well-oiled band by 1980, and they all just have to look at each other, or you know, give a funny look over it, and they know that Bruce is about to do something, and they better be ready for it.
Yeah, and that camaraderie really comes through in a lot of the photos too, especially the photo we'll talk about in just a minute, which is sort of your most famous photo of Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. What I so appreciate about him too, and you see it in the photos, but you also see it if you are a Bruce Springsteen fan and have gone to see him over time. He started off with a lot of that, you know, next Bob Dylan sort of journalistic, you know, caterwaul or whatever you want to call it. And then he quickly became like the next big thing, you know, and of course they've been looking for the next big thing in rock and roll since the Beatles, and before that Elvis, and, you know, so he very purposely at some point decided, I'm going to just confound you, and I'm going to do whatever I want to keep you on your toes. And so while you see him growing and changing sort of physically and sort of how he presents himself in his show, he's also challenging the listener to what they think Bruce should be. And so you lose some people along the way maybe, but you gain a lot more. And he had an awful lot of that go on, particularly once they kind of blew up in '84 and '85 with Born in the USA. And
so you've got the album and the tour that I think were his best-selling ever. Mm-hmm. And in 1984, he comes to Cleveland and plays the Richfield Coliseum. And I don't know if I expected this or not, because we didn't have YouTube or anything to keep us really up to the minute about what a performer looked like or what kind of show they were going to do. And Bruce also made a point of starting tours in Cleveland, or we were maybe the third place he played. And he did that because when he presented new music, he didn't have to sit in front of the critics in New York or LA and get criticized, you know, where he could come to Cleveland and be embraced, and the new music was supported as much as the old music. But in '84, we get definitely a different Bruce. He's been working out, he's pumped, he's like Super Bruce. I mean, I when he comes out on stage, I go, wow, and I get this is all fun, because it's like getting a whole new character to photograph. And it was super fun. It changed the dynamic of his shows. It did make it more about physicality and maybe even punched, harder than he ever did before. But he was that much more confident about himself as well.
And that energy was like a ball rolling down a hill, just gaining speed and momentum. And because he liked to start his tours in Cleveland or pretty close to Cleveland, he'd sort of get that momentum going slowly on the tour and build up to, this sort of rolling boil, I guess, in a place like Cleveland. And then he had the confidence and he had the audience kind of in the back pocket to go into, New York or LA or some of the other big markets and immediately just punch them,
Yep.
With all of that energy.
Literally
punch them. And that's part of why I think people love his shows so much too. I mean, it's a physical feat for him to do a 3-hour show,
yeah.
But it's a feat for the audience too to get a 3-hour show. I mean, you are wrung out at the end of it.
So 84, here's this new Bruce and this new show, and stronger than ever, more cohesive than ever. At one point in the show, and I think it's in Cadillac Ranch, it's just a part at the end of the song where the band, generally the whole band, comes to the lip of the stage. And I'm not really sure why it changed this night, but you had Clarence, Bruce in the middle, and Nils Lofgren. And I think I clicked maybe 2 frames of that. But when I got home and I processed it and saw the proof sheet and printed it, it took my breath away, because rock and roll photographers, all photographers, I believe, want to tell a story with their images. And when you do that way beyond you even intended, that's the magical part. So this photo to me encapsulated what Bruce's band was about, and it was about family, and it was about the fact that they were really, really close on and off stage. But on stage, as I said before, all they had to do was just look sideways at each other, and they knew what was going to happen. So it's probably the only one I'll really show you from the book, but because we'll have them on slides. But this shot, this 3-shot of Clarence and Bruce and Nils, just for me is like the Grand Slam home run, probably next to a Bowie shot, my favorite shot ever that I've taken.
In addition to wanting to sort of capture that essence of what a live rock and roll show is, photographers also want to capture life, and in doing so, they want it to be both still life, but also very vibrant, very active. And of course, that's a feat to do, especially in rock and roll, especially when people are running all over the place and you maybe don't even get enough time to snap those photos. And so, I mean, I say this, I think, every time we sit down and we talk rock and roll, but just the ability to capture those moments the way that you did with the technology as it was then.
Yeah.
It's a different story now. I mean, you can just put your finger on the shoot button and run, 200-300 photos before you've even thought about it, because it's all on a microchip on the inside of the inside of the camera. But if you're walking around with 24 shots on a roll of film, that's all you have. So just to have that, those moments captured in time is just brilliant.
And for young photographers, I'll just mention that we had no view screen, so you couldn't preview the photo. You just had to really, your view screen was your heart and your soul, because I had a hero of mine from the 60s, Baron Wolman, who shot Jimi Hendrix and Monterey Pop Festival, and he said, if you see the image in your viewfinder, you've already missed it, which is true, because you probably have a 60th of a second moment. And sports photographers do this, rock and roll photographers do it. You anticipate that something's going to happen, and you don't know when it is, but you position yourself, you anticipate, you check the lights, and then if you're really quiet inside, to the point of not even hearing the music, you'll know when to shoot. And I don't know that all rock and roll photographers do know, but that's because they don't trust their heart and soul. And this is a heart and soul of a fan. I mean, I grew up being a music fan, so I'm really in that space, and I don't hear the music, strangely, but I can capture it on film.
Yeah, I think the amazing part about that too is when you come to, I mean, I've been writing about rock and roll for a very long time too, and I came to it as a fan as well. It was actually what made me want to be a writer, because I couldn't play a guitar for anything. Bass guitar sometimes, but a regular guitar, which is what I really wanted to do, my fingers were just too short for that. You feel obligated, you feel connected to the material, you feel it speak to you. We talk about it being sort of a communion of sorts between the artist and the audience, and our jobs as journalists, writer journalists, photojournalists, whatever it is that we call ourselves, we're responsible for capturing the essence of that. And there's a huge responsibility in doing that because people care about it as much as we do.
Yep.
And with Bruce fans, you know, they would argue with you that they care about it more, you know, and they're ready to punch you about it potentially. But there's an inherent desire,
an obligation,
and an obligation to get it right, and to really fully characterize and inhabit what's happening as it happens. How about that?
How about that?
We can talk a little bit about like sort of, he comes back in '99. There's like an 11-year layoff.
Well, we'll also, just to finish that tour was so big, and again, was the biggest moneymaker tour they ever did, that they extended it. I mean, I don't know how long it totally lasted, probably a couple of years.
It was.
But they came back in '85 and played Cleveland Municipal Stadium. 80,000 people easy, and then then talk about the years where he goes off and does Bruce.
Yeah, he just kind of segues away from Bruce sort of being the superhero Bruce that we're sort of used to in '84 and '85 with Born in the USA. He comes back with The Tunnel of Love in '87, '88, that era. He emerges kind of like this Lothario, kind of embracing this sort of new romanticism. The band is sort of scattered about the stage, and it's all like under the guise of it being in a carnival tent, and there's a ticket taker and all kinds of like really interesting innuendo going on. And you could tell at that point that he was ready to say too, I'm ready to challenge you, but I'm also ready to challenge myself. I'm going to just bear what I want to bear. And so from there, that was kind of the last time we would see him with E Street for over a decade.
Yeah.
And when he came back here in '99,
right,
which is also in the book,
the reunion tour.
The reunion tour, that was for me, because I didn't get to see '84 or '85. I was just a wee bit young to go. That experience was just like having your head blown right off, because everybody in that audience was as excited about that show and the family coming back together, and just the energy. It was like the roof of the building was going to come right off.
Right.
I still get tingly even thinking about it, because in 3 hours he brought the house lights up for 20 minutes to finish out part of the show.
Where he could look at everybody at the same time. And then it was not just the family on stage, it was all those people are part of his family.
It's the family in the building.
Right.
There's no spotlight on me, it's on everybody.
Right.
And what a symbol. I mean, it's like he recognizes that the fans are as important to the whole works as he is, which is awesome.
And I think after '99, then I'm off. Well, that's the '90s. I was doing all kinds of different work for teen magazines, but he does the 2016 tour. What's the name of that one?
That one.
Oh, it's it's that one.
That one, the 2016 tour.
Yeah, it's the 2016 tour where he's honoring an anniversary of
The River.
Thank you. It's The River revisited.
Yes.
But I hadn't photographed him for a while, and I wanted kind of not a closure, because I'm guessing he'll still tour, and maybe I'll still photograph him. But it had been a while, and I wanted to see where he was at and where the band was, and what was an extreme difficulty for that audience was that Clarence had passed away, and I don't think anybody had seen the band without Clarence, at least, maybe in a few select cities, but in Cleveland, that was just a huge loss, and there were signs that were up like, "We miss you, Clarence," and I wanted to see how it felt for that family up on stage to lose somebody so important as Clarence, and I also wanted to see how Jake, Clarence's nephew, took over as the sax player. And it's really impossible to replace Clarence. Nobody really intended that to happen, but how cool was it that his nephew got the opportunity to step up? And he was so loved by that audience, and when there were moments where, say, Bruce and Nils came to the microphone, they would bring Jake up, and you knew, because he had his arms around Jake and Nils, that was family, and that really meant a lot. It really meant a lot for everybody out there in the audience, and I'll get all emotional talking about it, but it always makes me emotional because, again, here's a man who is so authentic and so real, and bears his soul, and all those bandmates up there, welcomed Jake with open arms, and Jake didn't disappoint either. He's a damn fine saxophone player.
Absolutely, he is. And that seems like it's a good segue into talking a little bit about how your vocation has changed, especially recently, with the technology that we mentioned before, but also a lot of the rules and restrictions around shooting photography too, and so concert photography in particular. You should talk about that a little bit. It
started in the 80s and actually started with the debut of MTV, where rock and roll had another way to be heard and now seen. It wasn't just radio. So to have a 24-hour station playing music videos, it also meant that bands were stepping up their game to be more glamorous, and their record labels were not only encouraging them, they were demanding, certain looks, and they began to, during live tours, restrict photographers to 3 songs at the beginning of a show, and then they'd toss you out the back door. And the reason for that, theoretically, was whereas rock and roll always was that kind of art where you just got sweaty and you sang and it didn't matter how you looked. That's the rough side of rock and roll. But now you had to be perfect. And so no woman, no Pat Benatar, for example, could perspire in a photograph, so they cut us off at 3 songs and, like I said, literally threw us out the door. And a lot of photographers at that point leave the business because there's just no way to really do that well at that point. In the 90s, digital starts to come in. Probably, I don't actually know when I was processing all that. It's probably more the 2000s for me. And I couldn't figure out what the digital was all about, in that the photo quality wasn't that great at the beginning, and I didn't see any advantages to it. It was during a marketing gig that I did for Tri-C Jazz Fest, where I got to be on the other side of marketing and see what digital could do for the industry. And what it could do was make it easier to grab content, written content, photographic content, and turn it around and send it out to the news media, which then helped us, Tri-C Jazz Fest, as an organization. Once I saw that, then I understood where I was going to be with digital. And I said, yeah, I don't have to send photos by Federal Express. I can work with them on the screen. I don't have to smell smelly chemicals to process my film. I can do it on the screen. And as technology improved, man, I just went for it because I could capture light that I couldn't capture before on film. Light and the way that lighting directors played with it in a band context became other characters on stage that you could use to make the photo have different dimensions. So, you know, I went full tilt after that into digital, and I think my favorite times were the 5 years that I shot for the Hard Rock Roxino that was out in Northfield. They had concerts. I probably shot 100 concerts a year, which was heaven for me. So since then...
But things have changed again. I mean,
yeah, there
here
we go.
are. I mean, things have already changed again, and it's changed a lot for you, too.
The technology is that, and bands, in fact, really could care less if we who know how to use a camera ever show up again. They'll let fans shoot with their cell phones, and you'll see a sea of cell phones. People aren't even watching the show. They're watching it through their cell phone. And bands have made peace with that, I guess, because that, I believe, is just the way it's going to be. They'll take the ticket money, they'll be singing to cell phones, and in the process, they'll get some free photos from their fans who send in their pictures.
Yeah, it's just changing the face, technology again, changing the face of something that I think was sort of an institution for a long time. Rock and roll photography being
that was sacred to us.
Sacred, yes. So,
okay.
So what's next for us?
Oh, we'll probably work on another book, but we're not done with this one yet. I
meant in the context of our conversation.
Oh!
But that's a good question too.
No, you know, what has been sad, and yet we have this media to encourage the fact that we get to talk to people who want to hear about Bruce and hear about the book, and Lakewood Library is making this available in this virtual way. And we're happy for the virtual way, but I can't wait to get out there and see people more often.
Same.
Yeah. And do some more photos.
Yes.
Not you, you write. Okay. Thank you. Hold.